fellow cyborgs, today I'm going to wrap up my Indigathon reading experience. This was a month-long readathon in November, hosted by Michelle from Thor Wants Another Letter and Bear from A2 Brody, and this was to encourage you to read books by Indigenous authors. I was able to read a lot during this Indigathon. I was able to read a lot during this month by Indigenous authors thanks to free audiobooks from my library and my glorious ears that can comprehend things at 2 times speed, and so I'm going to tell you about them from least to most enjoyed. First, I have 2 books that I did not finish, one of which I am semi-permanently DNFing, and I can be talked into trying it again at a later date, but for now it's over, and one that I'm still trying to work through, but it's very slow. So I have not given up on Dropbear by Evelyn Araluan. This is an Indigenous Australian author, and it's a mix of essays and poetry collections. However, her writing style is very little punctuation, lots of references to Australian pop culture and species of animals and flora and fauna that I do not recognize, which makes it more difficult for me to know where the punctuation is. She also has a pretty advanced vocabulary, so it's just very slow and confusing. However, I am almost done with the first part, and I'm hoping that the second part might be a little bit more easily understandable to people who aren't Australian, but if not, then I will just take my time and get out of it what I can get out of it. So still working on it. I am semi-permanently DNFing Apple in the Middle by Dawn Quigley. This was the group book read, and I spotted specifically for the readathon, and I was really looking forward to reading this, but I could only find it in paper format, and I'm really slow and unfocused with reading physically books lately. I would have been able to finish this if it was on audio. I think I would have enjoyed it more if it was on audio. That was strike one against the book. That is totally not the book's fault. The second thing that is totally not this book's fault is that there's a similar theme and plot in this book as there is in a book that I enjoyed so much I nearly loved it. And I read the book that I enjoyed so much and nearly loved first. So reading this was similar things, but just not as much to my taste. And then the final thing, and I think this is the book's fault, is that our main character, Apple, is supposed to be 16. She has grown up sheltered and super privileged in a white community, and she's going to spend the summer with her native family members, who are Ojibwa, I believe. She just seems like an 11-year-old. And I know she's supposed to kind of be quirky and potentially neurodivergent. However, she just came off as naive and rude, and I did not enjoy her voice. I think that if someone had narrated it to me and was able to communicate her humor more, I would have enjoyed it more or disliked it less. But unfortunately, there was only so much I could do in my own mind, and I was just not enjoying this. I made it to page 100, chapter 13, so 40% in or so, and I just could not make myself get through it. So I don't plan on trying this again. I would give it a 2.5 stars if I had to rate it. On Storygraph, you have a separate section that is the do not finish section that I'm exploring. So for now, that's where it lives. I really wanted to love this, but I did not. I could not finish it. So the next book I want to talk about is A TwoSpirit Journey, which is an autobiography of Mane Chakabe with Mary Louise Plummer. So this is an autobiography, and I unfortunately forgot that there is a difference between autobiography and memoir. So for me, a memoir is like a micro history of someone's life. It takes a theme or an event in their life, and then they give you vignettes around that theme or event. You're not getting an exhaustive tale of their life. An autobiography is an exhaustive tale of their life, mostly told chronologically, or at least that is what this book is. This book is also not beautifully written. The afterword says that this is intentional because Mane grew up very undereducated and wanted this story to be accessible to all sorts of people. However, it did not make the chronological, dry reading experience any more lively. This is also super triggering. I had not considered how many awful things I would have to read about because I'm reading about a woman who now identifies as two-spirit, or once identifies as lesbian, also identifies as two-spirit. I'm not 100% sure on that one. And all of the horrible things that happened to her in her lifetime. The parts are divided chronologically, but then there are also themed sections within those parts. And I think one of them was literally called sexual assault. I had to stop at times. It was not terribly graphic, but it was just a lot and unending. And she also talked about horrible things that she witnessed secondhand, and it was a lot. And I respect the fact that this happened to her and that we should acknowledge that this happened to her. I know it's a lot. And reading it is obviously nothing comes close to experiencing it, but it was just a lot that I did not expected. And the unexpected surprises were not necessarily positive ones for me. So I give this a 3-star rating, and now you know what to expect if you want to read this. And I learned things, and I value that I read this. I will not be rereading it, however. So next enjoyed was Native Plant Stories told by Joseph Bruchac. This is a part of a book, and it's like a book workbook called Keepers of Life by Michael J. Caduto and Joseph Bruchac. And the whole point of that book is to teach kids about their indigenous heritage while also training them to be better stewards of the planet. This is exactly that book, but just without those teaching lesson things. It's just the stories. I was super excited because I'm a planty person these days, and I wanted to know specifically about the stories that focus on plant life. And yeah, that's what happens in here. I just had wrong expectations. So this is traditional legends and stories that happen to have plants in them. Some of them focus on like why this plant is significant, or why this plant looks this way, or why this plant grows this way. But a lot of them were like focused on like another god or another hero figure, and then there just happened to be a plant in the story. And as you well know, if you've been with me for a while on my channel, that I love the idea of legends, myths, and fairy tales, but I do not actually enjoy reading them. This is also kind of split regionally, so you know like where the different tribes or bands of people are, and that factors into this plant story that's representing them. So that was cool. There's also like a glossary pronunciation guide at the back, which is also really cool. And I think I'm going to keep this on my shelves, but it was not a wholly enjoyable reading experience, and I did not learn enough about plants that I wanted to. So 3 stars. Next, let's talk about the poetry collection, It Was Never Going to Be Okay by Jay Simpson. Simpson is a two-spirit, non-binary trans woman, and this is a poetry collection pulling a lot from her experiences in the LGBTQIA2S+ community, but also other things. Overall, I enjoyed it. The sort of poetry that she writes is not my jam. There was a lot of unpacking of sexual experiences, which are just not my favorite thing to read in any situation. And there were a lot of things that went over my head because I do not share a lot of these experiences that she does. But I did enjoy the fact that she brought up being a large woman, being a fat woman. I have some experience with that identity. So I pulled some things from there that I enjoyed, or didn't enjoy, but I empathized with and I can understand a little bit more. I would be interested in reading more of Simpson's writing, but I don't think that her style and my preference, especially specifically with poetry, aligns all that much, but it was still a valuable reading experience, and I appreciated reading it, and I'm glad that I read it. So 3 stars for that poetry collection. So next, let's talk about Love After the End. This is a speculative fiction anthology written by indigiqueer authors, and this is edited by Joshua Whitehead. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. My favorite story and the sweetest story was the first one. Every other story after that had interesting ideas. A lot of them were dark, not necessarily triggering to read, but depressing, apocalyptic sort of situations, which aren't my favorite. I think I went into this hoping to like wholeheartedly love it and enjoy it. And I think that for me, I would have a better time reading it to pick it apart, analyze it, and look at the themes being explored. And there are moments in some stories that I remember and they still stick with me, but a lot of those moments are from the first few stories rather than the ones toward the end. No story except for the first one stuck out to me as an author I wanted to read more from necessarily. So this is what it delivers, though I warn you that the introduction is very academic. Do not be put off by the introduction. It is a lot easier to read than the introduction, the stories inside. But I didn't love this. I didn't love a lot of what this offered me. So 3.5 stars. I still recommend it. It's a very interesting read, and I got things out of it that will not probably leave my brain in a long time, but did not love it. 3.5 stars though. Next, let's talk about Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask by Anton Troyer. This is not an enjoyable reading experience as far as a nonfiction. There is no narrative, but it is incredibly informative, incredibly easy to read, and I really enjoyed how Troyer was very clear at the outset that these are his personal experiences with the sorts of questions and opinions surrounding the Native community. And take everything he says with a grain of salt, because somebody else in that part of that community is going to disagree with him. I was faced with the naivete of me wanting one book to tell me how to not offend Native people, because that's not how it works. There was a lot of really interesting information in here, and basic information that I wanted to know. Like, is it tribe? Is it band? Is it nation? And the answer is maybe. Find out. So I enjoyed how realistic this was, and I also learned about questions that I didn't even know to ask. I would have to have a physical copy to highlight and digest more slowly if I truly wanted to remember every single thing I learned. And I'm not really interested in that. I think I want to just pursue more nonfiction written about Native cultures by Native authors. So it did what it set out to do, but I wasn't terribly in love with how it went about doing that or the conclusions it drew. So 3.5 stars, I do recommend. I feel like it was a good primer, especially for white people. And you should probably read this book or something like it if you haven't read something like it before. And I gave it 3.5 stars. Now let's talk about Two Old Women by Velma Wallace. I also gave this 3.5 stars. Long story short, I enjoyed this book. It is a fable in the disguise of a novel. And when I first read the title, which does have a subtitle, it's something like Survival and Betrayal in the Alaskan Wilderness or something like that, I thought it was a true crime nonfiction. Turns out, no, that's not what it is at all. But for what it is, it was enjoyable. It's about two old women whose tribe decides to leave them behind in a really harsh winter because they don't contribute and they complain all the time. And times are tough and people are going to die, and they do not have resources to feed them anymore. And instead of just sitting down and succumbing to the elements, these women get a new lease on life and learn how to be incredibly self-sufficient and end up teaching their tribe a few lessons as well. And it was really interesting. I liked it. It was easy to read. It was super short. I would read more by this author, but my library does not have the other book that they talked about in her bibliography, but I would totally read that. I liked it more, obviously, since it's higher up on the list than Native Plant Stories. It was enjoyable. There was just enough characterization to where people weren't archetypes, but they were still kind of archetypal. So yeah, it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed the fact that our protagonists were two elderly women. It was cool. So 3.5 stars. I recommend. Read it if you get a chance. It'll take you an afternoon. So next I read The Sea in Winter by Christine Day. This was good, and I enjoyed it, but now having some time after finishing it, I don't remember why I enjoyed it at a 4-star level. There are things it's a lot of grief. There's cold Pacific Northwest beaches. There's coming home to ancestral lands that we had to leave for one reason or another. There's family being awesome. There's learning how to redefine your life when the dreams and the future you had for yourself is no longer attainable. And I don't remember very much else. But I gave this 4 stars. I don't remember why. I think you should try it though and see what you think about it. And maybe I will remember why I rated it 4 stars. But I gave it 4 stars. And I did enjoy it more than these other books. I just don't think it maybe was impactful as some of the other books that I have previously discussed with you. But give it a try. I will read more by this author. I will give her more of a try. So 4 stars for The Sea in Winter. So next, let's talk about Winter Counts by David Heska Wambly Wyden. This is a contemporary thriller set on a reservation where a vigilante enforcer, you could say, who doesn't really have his life together and is trying to do right by the few people he cares about, is trying to figure out how drugs are getting on the reservation because now his beloved nephew is wrapped up in it. I liked, like, the mystery was fine. It was enjoyable. It was mysterious. I kind of knew what was going on from the beginning, but that's neither here nor there. I loved our main character, whose name escapes me. I loved his personal growth development. That was my favorite part of this book. I also loved the feeling of family. I also loved a very tangential plot point of indigenous food culture and what that actually means and what the future of it is. There were a lot of little fun things in here that were not related to the plot at large that I really enjoyed. This was fun. There were dark moments. However, it was not too much for me, and I recommend it. It was fun. I'm making my mom read it, and who knows who else I will make read, but it was really enjoyable. I give it 4 stars. You should try it. You should give it a try if anything I said appeals to you. I was able to sneak in Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones, which is a novella, horror novella, and it was great. This has a trope that is one of my favorites that I have mentioned recently, but I can't mention here because it is part of the glorious journey of reading this novella. You should read it. It gets dark and graphic and violent, but you should read it because it was great. The end. 4 stars. I will continue reading Stephen Graham Jones because he seems to be great. I also mind blown heard from the Midnight Librarian that Robin Wall Kimmerer, author of Braiding Sweetgrass, which was one of my favorite books of 2020, but that I never told you about because I never made a 2020 Best Books of the Year video. She had another nonfiction called Gathering Moss, all about moss. And so my library had the audiobook and I read that, and it was comforting and wonderful. And you should never pick moss in nature, and you should not buy moss in stores because they harvest it from nature. And mosses are awesome and take a long time to grow and have very specific environments that they can grow in. And there are so many different kinds of them, and you should never harvest moss. And you should read this book if you want a cozy nature nonfiction that is all about a plant that you probably never considered or maybe never saw if you live in the Southwest like I do. It was excellent. I did not love it as much as Braiding Sweetgrass, but I gave it 4.25 stars, and I will read anything that Wall Kimmerer publishes. So next is my favorite book of the readathon, but not my highest rated book of the readathon, The Brave by James Bird. This is great. This is a middle grade /YA. Our main protagonist is 12. He feels 16 to me, or maybe 14. Doesn't matter. And he has lived with his white father all of his life, but he has just gotten into the last fight at school because he fought back against a bully, and now he's getting expelled. Because he has I don't think they ever use the term OCD, but it feels very OCD, where he has to count the number of letters in whatever anybody says to him, and he has to say that number before he can speak. And he can't not do this. He has to do this. He gets bullied for it. His father says, I cannot deal with you anymore. You're going to go live with your mother now on reservation because your mother is Native. And there he learns what it means to be a part of a family. He learns about that side of his family. He learns that he has a brother and he tries to connect with that brother. And he also meets a wonderful young lady who has some medical issue going on, but she refuses to talk about it and only says that she is transforming into a butterfly. And she is excellent, and she helps him reconnect with this part of his family and helps him feel good about himself. There's a really interesting dichotomy between, like, how does white culture view whatever it is he's got going on with the counting thing, and how does Native culture view this? And it's not entirely divorced perspectives, but it is different. There's a fun twist with one of the characters at the end, which doesn't matter, but is excellent and great. He also has an adorable dog, and I'm not a dog person, but I was pro this dog. It is so good. So many themes about, like, grief, understanding yourself, understanding your family, loving people who can't be with you anymore. And it is good. It is sad, but it is great. You should read it. It is written beautifully. I loved the voice. The audiobook was great. Should I buy a physical copy? I've been asking myself this for 3 weeks. I don't know, but it is good. Not 3 weeks, 2 weeks. I don't know. Time is weird. It's great. You should read The Brave by James Bird and then talk to me about it. 4.5 stars. Will love it, probably in the future when I reread it, which I will be doing at some point. The book that got the highest rating for Indigathon was Wayaka the Bird Who Fell in Love with the Sun by Cindy Alvitre and with illustrations by Carly Lake. This is a children's picture book, and it is a origin story myth about the Tongva people on whose land I live. And the illustrations were watercolor, very like indigenous feeling, even though Carly Lake is not indigenous at all. And I also loved how the story was like origin story turns into legend to explain a natural thing. The illustrations were great, and I liked the story a lot. I liked how it was a combo of two kinds of legends. It is beautiful. I will purchase a copy. It is just a matter of when, or if somebody does it for me. 5 stars, love it, want it in my collection, not only because it's a beautiful book, but also to remind myself that I have so much white privilege. You should read it if you get a chance. It is beautiful and wonderful and simple and great. 5 stars, excellent. I really enjoyed this Indigathon, and I will be reading more books by Indigenous authors throughout the year, because remember, I've got that Indigenous TBR I want to work on for the rest of this year and heading into the next year. I think it is doable because my beautiful libraries have free audiobooks. So wish me luck on that project. I'm sure I will enjoy the heckle noodles out of it, and I will be rereading The Brave and Waa'aka at some point. So please let me know how your Indigathon went. Did you participate? What was the highlight read? Are there any books you were not impressed with that maybe I should skip or put until last? And until next time, read books by Indigenous authors, man. You'd be surprised how many there are out there. You can do it. You can use my TBR video as a resource and continue to be lovely.